is over. The time of the orc has come.
Come on, Dougal, lighten up!
Kaya, place. Good. Now they're all sitting comfortably, I wanted to begin this crap properly. Originally, I wanted to make this video on how to fail at orcs being empathetic and insist on how to actually succeed at such things. To be honest, that would have been a pretty easy subject to cover because it's already been done twice, but something else has come to my attention, especially a very bizarre notion in my country about Tolkien's works effectively being racist. Now, this comes from Nottingham University, and if you don't know a lot about universities in my country, they tend to do quite a bit of universitying. And this particular one was saying that it would fail students if they did not agree that Tolkien was in fact a racist. All right, pretty hardcore that is. I thought universities were meant to be a place where you debate such things, but then again, here we are. And because I agree in fairness in this channel, or at least do my best to work in fairness, I am only human at the end of the day. We're going to go into some of their best arguments as to why Tolkien was indeed a racist, and then we're going to go into the arguments why it's incredibly flimsy. But without further ado, here we go. See them orcs? They are, or were, squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the Europeans, or two Europeans' least lovely Mongol types. On surface vision, referring to them as slant-eyed or Mongol types is pretty clear-cut and seems pretty damning at this point. But there is a little bit more to it if you're willing to listen to his context. The phrasing does in fact include the parenthetical two Europeans, which suggests Tolkien is writing from a European aesthetic perspective rather than a factual claim about Mongols. The phrase degraded and repulsive versions implies he's describing corrupted beings, not actual Mongols themselves. And not that this matters to anybody, because hearing that Trump said grabbed by the pussy in a private conversation years ago, this was in a private letter, not part of his published narrative or legendarium or the books themselves. They don't exactly give this description. So whatever that's worth, saying it in private opposed to overtly saying it in his books. I think before we go any further, it's also important to note that Tolkien actually regretted a lot of the descriptions he gave about orcs, especially the ones that leaned into real-world racism or about them being inherently evil. Tolkien himself also had quite a lot of inherent struggles with the basis of good and evil. And one of his quotes was believing that evil cannot create life and only mock it, which, in his eyes, portraying an entire race as wholly evil created a theological dilemma. He also repeatedly revised the origin of orcs, went through corrupted elves, corrupted men, beasts, because he couldn't settle on how a soul capable of being inherently evil could be born. Another argument I've been hearing is scholars have been discussing Tolkien's world features a hierarchy of people. For example, elves at the top, men next, orcs at the bottom, which mirrors racial hierarchy ideas. For example, Robert Stewart's Tolkien, Race and Racism in Middle-earth says Tolkien was a racialist and that his mythology built on different races with different attributes. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but anyone that knows anything about Tolkien's work knows that he hated allegory, and a lot of the stuff within his messagings about the different races did not have evil linked to the races, if this makes sense. But I'll go into Robert Stewart's racial hierarchy plan for Tolkien's work first. It was elves at top, men next, then it was dwarves, then it was orcs at the bottom, then evil humans were below that. The difference is what Tolkien would say is your race was effectively irrelevant because you could be evil and white, you could be an Easterling and morally righteous, you could be a dwarf, an elf, a hobbit, and morally righteous. What mattered was what you believed on the inside, or as some would say, the content of your character. He would also argue that all the good elements were all nice and light and, well, white, and all the evil ones were dark and dark skinned and everything else. But allow me to bring in Scotland's former First Minister, Humza Yousaf, to allow me to help with this point.
The Lord President, white. The Lord Justice Clerk, white. Every High Court judge, white. The Lord Advocate, white. The Solicitor General, white. The Chief Constable, white. Every Deputy Chief Constable, white.
The member of the Fellowship that also tried to take the ring? Oh, sorry. Thank you, Humza. But I'm going to keep repeating until I'm blue in the face about how Tolkien hated allegory. If you're unsure of what I mean by allegory, remember that book by George Orwell, Animal Farm? On the surface, it appears to be a book about animals overthrowing the farmers and putting in their own government, which eventually turns into the exact same government that they just sacrificed a lot to get rid of. What the book is actually about is the Russian Revolution, and that's actually one of the things that stopped it getting published a lot of the time. Tolkien did not want to add any form of his own animal farminess into the Lord of the Rings, as his exact words was he despised it in every single form. Allegory, not Animal Farm. What does in fact cause evil or brings people to do evil within Tolkien's story wasn't your race, your religion, or anything else. It was in fact an object. The ring itself isn't anything particularly special. It seems to be more of a hindrance than anything else, as wearing it makes the main bad guy immediately know your exact location and he will send everything he can down in your direction. Yeah, it makes you invisible, and yes, it can extend your life considerably, and yes, it can absolutely corrupt you, but its main power source is actually amplifying what you already have inside you, basically your lust and craving for power, which inevitably will corrupt you. We can see this heavily with Boromir, as that he wants to steal the ring for defense of Gondor. What that'll in fact do is just amplify his wanting to defend it harder and harder. And it'll also corrupt his body and everything else. So what it does is it actually brings out the worst parts of your personality, the worst parts that you in fact have inside of you. And this, as I've said before, doesn't have anything to do with where you're born, your race, your religion, as there is only one religion in the Lord of the Rings, which is to the one. What causes you to become evil is you yourself. If by this point that I've gone through pretty much all the arguments aside from the one that the government website put up, which I'm only going to touch on for half a second because you cannot control how other people choose to portray your work. Okay, done, sound, finished. Although within the statement that there would not be a Shire, as if evil was allowed to continue, anything nice left in the world would be destroyed. The fact that ICE and the government website are using it has got nothing to do with Tolkien, so do with that what you will. That's their choice to do it. Whether you choose to read racism into that or anything else is entirely down to you. What I'm trying to go with is what the man himself would do and what he would say. So I'm going to touch the last bit of this argument on what kind of man Tolkien was. So Tolkien was not born into an immense amount of riches. In fact, he was incredibly poor. And he then worked very hard and managed to get a good education. By the time he was 23, he was commissioned as an officer in World War One and specialized in communications. His job was to get communications through the trenches no matter what. During this time, Tolkien would have dealt with a lot of shelling. He would have dealt with a lot of close friends, unfortunately, not seeing another sunrise. He would have dealt with chlorine gas, which wants to turn your insides your outsides. And he also dealt with the Battle of the Somme. The Battle of the Somme, if you're unaware, is an incredibly bloody, incredibly violent battle, and it did also inspire the dead marshes within the story. Tolkien described a lot of the experiences he's seen in World War One as nothing more than animal horror, which is a pretty hardcore way of describing things. Tolkien was also sent home dealing with trench fever, And as he was recovering, God decided that its sense of humor wasn't funny enough and decided to also hit the UK with the Spanish flu. And Tolkien, obviously, in the position he was in, it's almost guaranteed that he would have been infected with the disease. To add an extra pants down special onto that, the economy was also in collapse. And around 1929, if I'm not mistaken, was the Great Depression. Then, in and around the 1930s to 1940s, fascism and National Socialism was rising in Europe, and it also birthed the Mustache Man, which Tolkien also was not a huge fan of. So, Tolkien ended up writing his books between World War II and shortly after, and didn't see great commercial success until 1954, when he was already a fully grown man by this point. I'm not doing the calculations in my head because I'm thinking of other things. Tolkien, as well, despite describing the orcs in the way he did as inherently evil and slant eyed, etc., he did also express regret within these descriptions. And bear in mind as well that a lot of his characters, i.e., the Easterlings, they were also portrayed as evil. That is also correct. Although he did not tie the evilness to their race, and race hierarchies was not his creation. And Tolkien, for any of his flaws, and bear in mind he is also a human being, for his time seemed incredibly anti-racist and was a big despiser of Hitler. So, all that being said, if you still believe the man was some kind of mega racist, then I would suggest you should probably get out more, because you should probably see the rest of the world and see what it actually looks like. Because personally, I think what we've all said here, and comparing Tolkien to other authors around during that time, i.e., Lovecraft, that he actually seemed like a pretty cool guy. So if you still disagree and say he's a racist, well,
You're breaking our heart. Saddle up. Let's get this movable feast underway.
Rings of Power is one of them. I didn't enjoy any part of it, I'm going to be completely honest. A lot of the battles, I didn't really understand who was winning, who was losing. I didn't understand if I should care, who I should root for. Galadriel was a pretty boring character, and, well, you know the rest. Tactically, it's quite annoying. I find myself yelling at the screen quite a lot like an old man yelling at a cloud, but I don't want to talk about any of that right now. So if you want to jump into the comments and call me a prick for not wanting to, well, you just go ahead and do that. I don't care. What I am going to discuss is the orcs. Now, we do see the orcs in various iterations, but this scene has kind of become infamous because we see a frightened looking orc living in some kind of mud hut thing, whatever it is, hole in the ground. And we see him cradling his baby and going up to his orc wife and looking pretty terrified about the prospect of having to go to war. Now, for most people, this should be a horrible prospect, and we should be feeling very sorry for this orc. But in reality, we just don't care because it's really, really obvious what they're trying to do. It's surface level, it's boring. And if I'm going to draw any parallels, I'm going to jump in and say about Abby from The Last of Us 2. Now, Joel is a pretty fucked up protagonist from the first game. He is literally described as someone that has few moral lines left to cross. Yet we imprint on Joel and we very much empathize with Joel. Who we don't empathize with is Abby. And the game does everything it can in its power to make us feel sorry for Abby. For example, it will show her dad being this overly nice zebra whispering sad arse that is winning every single Patton Oswalt contest he goes to. Yet we don't care about him. And Abby uses the death of her father as motivation to kill Joel, and that is why we should feel bad for her. It then also takes us on the revenge quest, or rather, Ellie's revenge quest, and what Abby was doing at the time. And she's doing all this altruistic things. Does it make me feel less sorry for her, or more sorry for her, should I say? No, not really. By the end of the story, you still want her dead. So the same thing happens with these orcs. They've done a ton of things that is fucked up, and it doesn't change your mind on whether or not you want to see him dead or not. So no, this is lazy, this is pointless, and this is boring. At least it's not as bad as Last of Us 2, where the only motivation is, you killed my dad? Oh, well, hey! You killed my dad. Now prepare to die. As I mentioned previously, this is going to be the easiest fix in video essay history, even though I do not believe in this being a video essay. Orcs were perfect within the Peter Jackson trilogy as they were, because they had their own little characteristics. They were very quotable, and they were pure batshit evil. See, when you witness the fight with Lurtz versus Boromir, then Lurtz versus Aragorn, you can see a lot of the tiny little idiosyncrasies behind the character himself. When Aragorn gets grabbed by Lurtz, it isn't one of the old school tropes where he gets thrown about and no damage is done. Lurtz headbutts the living shit out of him, then smacks him into infinity. After that, Lurtz pulls out the dagger from his leg, licks the blood off it, then wings it at Aragorn. The geek inside me is screaming to try and tell you that that wasn't actually a prop knife, it was real, and that Viggo Mortensen himself actually deflected it, which is why it looks so, well, realistic. In spirit of whatever the hell I'm building here, if we're going to go for truly evil characters being evil characters, I would also say another media parallel would be Sinister Mark. Now, he has a very short amount of screen time, but the amount he's in, you absolutely remember him, and you wouldn't change him because he's so slick with his evil.
You actually thought you could hide from me? My God. Look at you. Pathetic. You're making me feel bad, man.
On the flip side of this, if you don't build up your antagonist with enough menace and enough danger surrounding them, you end up running into the same risk that you do with the TV's iteration of The Boys. Now, I used to love that show, I mean, from season 1, and if you watch only Butcher's parts in season 3 and maybe season 4, it's actually pretty tolerable. But everything else, you just kind of, or at least in my eyes, I'm screaming out for the villains to actually do something, to be menacing, to be terrifying. And with Lord of the Rings, at least in the Fellowship of the Ring, when you first meet the Uruk-hai and Lurtz, you're actually kind of shown how dangerous these things really are and how much you should respect how much you will get fucked up by these things if you end up in open combat with them. So my big disagreement, obviously, within the Rings of Power, we do have orcs that are dangerous, but the fact that they tried to show them as being empathetic, I think, is completely wrong. I think it's a good thing showing that they are beings of true menace, because I remember Lurtz. I remember being terrified of him as a child. I remember seeing half the crazy shit he was doing and thinking, damn, I would not want to fight that guy. And you know what it did as a result for Aragorn beating him? It built up Aragorn. It made Aragorn seem like a real fighter. It seemed like he had determination. And without Aragorn being built up in such a way, would you really follow him? Would you really believe he could do the things he does later? Probably not. So that's my closing argument. You need characters like Sinister Mark. You need Homelander to be, well, a menace. And you need orcs like Lurtz, like Gothmog, and the rest to actually be menacing. Because otherwise, what the fuck are we doing here? Last thing I would want for any kind of show that I would be writing would be for my audience to be wanting the antagonist to, well, be bad guys.
A pearl and one like me prances and dances and sings with glee. Wherever there's strife, the singer is there. He slaughters and slays with such merry flair. I sing this song with all my breath. Take heed!
Thanks for that. I believe this needs no title and no further introduction because it's that obvious. Shadow of War, if you haven't played it, is a game where you play as Talion, who is known as the Grave Walker. Basically, his spirit is bound to an undead elf known as Celebrimbor. If you're familiar with anything to do with Tolkien, you'll remember that name. He's one of the elves that built the ring. And also a great big enemy of Sauron. Celebrimbor works as the Wraith. Eventually, as you two work together, you get given a special kind of orc recruiting ring. And what this recruiting ring allows you to do is to bring in orcs to fight for your cause, and namely orc captains. Each orc you tend to deal with, if if they're anything special, they tend to have a bit of a personality quirk going on. For me, going through my playthrough, it was one called Deathbone, and there was also the Machine. Machine and Deathbone were pretty much banes of my existence because Deathbone is pretty much the Darth Bleeding Vader of this franchise, and Deathbone just doesn't die, and he bites your throat out if he beats you. So, anyhow, All the orcs in this have got their own personality traits. As you've seen from the bard, he likes to sing. There's also a rhymer. There's also a grog maker who likes his grog. And you end up in some of the funniest scenarios you could ever imagine with these orcs. And something really strange actually happens to you once you played it for a while. You actually grow attached to them. So if you have Garl the drunk and he ends up betraying you, you actually feel pretty bad about it. Or if your fortress gets overthrown and you have Ushnik or Grashnag or whatever the hell, and they're taken prisoner and you can't get to them fast enough before they bleed out, it feels pretty shit, and you do end up empathizing with them. Although this is difficult to achieve with cinema, and it is easier to achieve with the game as you're spending a lot of time with them and you have effectively skin in the game, it is actually doable the other way around, is bringing in an orc that is a flawed character and then building them up. Eventually, when they do succumb to whatever illness, injury, or whatever have you, your audience will be invested in them and will probably view orcs in a different light. Coming back to the whole Tolkien discussion earlier about him being this mega racist, is one of the regrets he did say is about having a race that was inherently evil. Seeing as we have elves and men and potentially even dwarves that fight for the Dark Lord, if we did have the odd orc here and there that were fighting for the side of, well, the side of good, then yeah, it might reflect that. But in the meantime, we do have Shadow of War that does show all the personality quirks of orcs. And yes, you do get attached to them. So that's how I'm finally going to conclude this non-video essay, is by saying sometimes if you want to make things empathetic, if you go for the surface level, but this person has a family or there's children involved or I have a wife and I don't actually want to get involved in war, it's just following orders, you're going to fall flat on your face. Whereas Shadow of War, Shadow of Mordor flips it on its head and has every orc living for battle, living for death, but they have their own quirks and their own little motivations. Especially a character like Ratbag, you're attached to him from dot one, and he even brings up a great point during the mission where Bruce betrays you, is he says, like it or not, we're your boys, and if you don't fight for us, why would we fight for you? Now that was paraphrasing. However, like I said with my neat conclusion earlier, having orcs as inherently evil is totally fine. It doesn't make them racist and it doesn't make it wrong. If you try and do subtle changes and surface level shit, it comes across as shallow. If you want your audience to be invested in said orcs, you gotta do a little bit more. So there's two examples: Peter Jackson trilogy and the Shadow of Mordor trilogy. Duology? 2 games, there's 2 of them. Duo. Anyway, if you managed to get all the way through that, I'd much appreciate if you chat some shit in my comment section. Lord knows there's going to be people doing that anyway. But if you like my stuff and you want to see me grow, check out my video on why John Walker should wield Mjolnir and my video that I regret, which is my Last of Us one. Never do a speech when you're angry or it'll be the best speech you ever regret. So stay sitting comfortably and just do whatever the fuck you like. It's your life.